Thanks very much, everyone, for joining. Guys, we're just going to give it 3 more minutes just to allow some additional attendees to join the call. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. If we could just give it 2 more minutes, that would be great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on IR35 reform, Journey to April 2021. So I think as all our attendees will appreciate, the clock is ticking with regards to the IR35 legislation coming into force on the 6th of April. So just a warm welcome to everyone who's attending today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining. This is the second in our series of webinars, and we intend to have 2 more before the IR35 go live. So I'm really pleased, folks, to be joined today by 2 fantastic speakers and experts on the topic of workforce management and IR35. I'm really pleased to introduce you firstly to Julia Kermode, who is the founder and director of iWork. Many of you will know Julia on the call from her advocacy work, her podcast, her championing of independent workers' rights, gig workers' rights, and agency workers' rights. And prior to setting up iWork, Julia was the CEO of FCSA, a leading industry body for umbrella companies. I hope I've got that right, Julia, and a warm welcome to you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Julia. I'm also pleased to be joined today, folks, by Declan Bradley, who is Legal Director and IR35 Specialist at workplace law firm Doyle Clayton. Declan, like myself, is from Northern Ireland. He's based in London. He's a leading expert, speaker, and advisor to large and medium-sized enterprises on all things IR35. So Declan and Julia both have a lot to say on this particular topic. And of course, for anyone listening, it's not too late to get ready for IR35. There's still time to prepare, as daunting as that might seem, but there's still time. So we're going to focus on the following areas today, guys. Thank you, Connor. So just we're going to briefly recap on what IR35 is. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there's still a lot of organizations that aren't fully aware of what IR35 is, the impact on IR35, how they should prepare for IR35, and how they're going to mitigate the risks arising from IR35. So we're going to look at some of the problems that organizations might face, some of the problems fee payers might face, and how best to work with your recruitment supply chain in relation to IR35. And of course, if you get it wrong, there's some penalties, and penalties are never good, either financially or reputationally. We're going to look as well, because there has been some confusion within the market around which category of workers IR35 impacts and how they'll be impacted by that. We're also going to look at the CEST tool, why it's been so problematic, and is there any alternatives to it, and what organizations can do to mitigate some of the problems that the CEST tool has created. Like many things in the outsourcing industry, we do love an acronym, MSP, VMS, IR35. So we're going to look at what is an SDS, a status determination statement. How best should an organization communicate this? Is less more, or is more communication and more information better to protect the end user? We're also going to look at some of the impacts that taking a blanket approach to IR35 might create, and how an organization should take something called reasonable care when they're making these determinations and decisions. And we're going to look at one other thing, which is potentially problematic, but is there any risks when it comes to utilizing an umbrella company or other fee payer for your organization? And it's not on the list, but we've had a lot of interest, guys, the last couple of days in relation to, is statement of work a good way to mitigate IR35 risk, or just remove the risk of IR35 altogether? So hopefully we'll have a bit of a debate on that. I see some old friends and current friends on the call who I know will have lots of questions, and good questions at that. And I'd like to welcome as well Martin Bogus, who I haven't seen in quite some time. And Martin has recently completed a master's specializing in this particular topic. So Martin, looking forward to hearing lots of questions from you. Just moving on briefly to some housekeeping as well, folks. If you would do the courtesy of muting your lines, please, that would be great. Any questions, please ask them through the chat function. We've got Connor Lavelle, yes, another Connor, on the call today, who's our marketing lead, and his responsibility is to package up the questions, and we might take a break throughout just to ask them. We are recording the session today, and hopefully everyone on the call is comfortable with that. If not, please do let us know through the chat function as soon as possible. So without any further ado, guys, we'll launch into it. So Declan, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us today.
No problem at all.
Thank you very much. So Declan, just if we look at some of the discussion points that we're going to focus on, Connor, if you could just go back to the discussion point slide, please. Thank you. So Declan, what is IR35 in the private sector?
Okay, so IR35 is just more or less a nickname given to lots of legislation which seeks to tackle disguised employment through contractors using intermediary companies. So IR35, I think, was the name of a HMRC bulletin way back 20 years ago or something like that. So it's not actually the name of the legislation. The legislation set out in the ITPA and also the Social Security contributions regulations. So all very, very exciting, interesting legislation that you have to wade through, as well as HMRC guidance, and also recovery of debt legislation and whatever else. So it's been around for a while, IR35. I'll just call it IR35 because the rest of it's a bit of a mouthful. It's been around for a while, but in the current position that has been around for a while in the private sector is that if you have a contractor who's operating through an intermediary company, and that's usually a personal service company that they control, and I'll just say personal service company from now on, it's that contractor's obligation to do an assessment on their own engagements and notify HMRC about whether they're a deemed employee or office holder for tax purposes or not. And as far as I'm aware, everyone's not, it seems. I'm not sure how many contractors actually put their hands up and say, my engagements are PAYE. And it's obviously been hard for HMRC to do anything about that, because I don't have the statistics to hand. Julia might know how many contractors are actually operating through intermediary companies out there. Hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, who knows. And so it's difficult to police that. And so what the government did, obviously, I think it was 2017, they changed it in the public sector, now changing it in the private sector from the 6th of April 2021, where there are these contractors operating through these personal service companies. They're flipping their responsibilities over to the corporate that they engage with. A bit like GDPR, just get people mainly to sort of police themselves, And that's, I think that's sort of the aim behind it, as well as them using their 250 investigators to go in and do investigations with the big boys first, most likely. But what will happen from the 6th of April is that the responsibility for doing that assessment to look at the engagement and to determine if the contractor is a deemed employee or an office holder for tax purposes or not. Now that falls to the client, the end user client. And then the client has to do this, which you've mentioned already, the status determination statement, the SDS, setting out their decision on that. And then they have to pass that down the chain. So mainly they pass it to the individual contractor. And then if they do have a chain, they pass it, a recruitment chain, they pass it to the next, or the agency that they contract with. And then that SDS is supposed to get passed down that chain to the fee payer, or else the other people in the chain will be the fee payer. And then the fee payer, so this person, they have to be this person, company or person, they have to be UK based and not be controlled by sort of the contractor. It is then their responsibility. If it's an outside IR35 engagement, so i.e. self-employed, it's their risk of HMRC coming after them. And if it's inside, it's their responsibility to run the new style payroll that is needed for that on the deemed direct payment, it's called. And they have to deduct the income tax and employees' national insurance contributions, as well as pay their own employers' NICs and apprenticeship levy. So that is kind of it in a nutshell. In terms of what IR35 is. It's essentially now the client has to do that assessment to determine work status. And then either they use a fee payer or they're the fee payer to then take the risk or run the payroll. I probably should also say that IR35 status decision is a tax decision. It's not an employment rights decision. The contractors do not automatically get employment rights. They would have to go off separately to the employment tribunal or the courts and claim for those. And you just have to assess internally with individual contractors, depending on the relationship, how big a risk is that. And we'll probably talk more about that anyway later in the discussion.
Thanks, Declan, and really appreciate that insight. And Declan, what sort of organizations in terms of size are impacted by IR35? So is there a certain size of organization that has to do this? So for example, if you're a small business, medium-sized business, must they start this process if they've got contractors in their business or supply chain? Exactly,
that's a good reminder, and I jumped over that bit. So the reforms only come in for medium or large businesses and businesses who have a UK connection. So to flip that around, if you're a small company under the Companies Act definition, or a wholly overseas company, then the IR35 reforms don't apply. And if you use contractors who are based in Spain or New Zealand or America, and they're always based there and there's tax resident there, then it shouldn't apply either. But what is a small company? So if I can remember this correctly off the top of my head, so it's if you satisfy two of these, then you are a small company. So it's not more than 10.2 million on your turnover, not more than 5.1 million on your balance sheet, and not more than 50 employees, which is a kind of average calculation that you have to do. And there's very particular rules around how you work that out and which financial year. It's your own financial year that you use. And so you have to just work out which financial year is actually relevant. And if you were a small company, then you kind of have to meet the obligations for 2 years before you actually lose that status. So it's not just as simple as that. No, there is a whole sort of legislative piece around it. But having looked at the attendee list, I'm not sure there's many in there that would be hopeful around that, to be honest. So that is the small business, the small companies piece. The wholly overseas, if you have a UK connection, like a permanent establishment, like a factory, an office, construction site, something like that here, you're going to have a UK connection. You'll probably have a permanent establishment. That's more for an accountant to really determine. But no, that kind of thing you would think about. If you have an agent here who is doing business on your behalf here, you're likely to have a UK connection, so it would bite. And from listening to my accountancy contacts, don't try and put in place international arrangements just to try and get around this, that you're getting into even more, I think, apparently more penalties in that case. So yeah, don't just create these arrangements internationally to try and get out of IR35 if the services, etc., are all still being performed here for the UK company.
Right, thanks, Declan. And Julia, just going back in time, I know we don't have a 1985 DeLorean here for the purposes of today's webinar, but just going back and looking at the public sector when IR35 was brought in, what lessons can we and should we learn in relation to that?
Gosh, well, there were loads. So much took place at that time. One of the major things that happened a lot is blanket determinations, and it happened so much so that HMRC have, and I know we're covering it later, brought in this reasonable care part to the new off-payroll changes coming this year, which basically means that blanket determinations should not be taken. But in short, a blanket determination is where a client looked at their workforce and said, yep, you're all inside IR35, which means that you all must be taxed as an employee, even though you're not an employee. And obviously those blanket determinations then had an impact on the pay rates. So some end clients were not then able to increase the pay to take account of the employment taxes, so employers' national insurance and that sort of thing. So sometimes the pay rates didn't change. So that meant the contractors were essentially absorbing those costs in what used to be their contract rate. So they were kind of getting a double whammy because their income was being reduced because it was being taxed, and also they were effectively paying employers' national insurance. So the impact of that, the blanket changes and the reduced income, meant that some contractors left their roles. They decided, no, I don't want this inside IR35 position. So they went to look elsewhere for an outside IR35 role. And that may very well happen again this year. The only lesson to be learned there is that this year these changes are being brought into the private sector to kind of equal it out. So at the moment, off payroll is only in the public sector. And so at the time when those changes came in, affected people then had the private sector potentially that they could work in as an alternative, whereas this year it's going to kind of level up the playing field. So that may not happen to the same extent, but in the public sector, it was a very real problem. And there were all sorts of things whereby different public sector projects were then delayed as a result because they didn't have the workforce, because the workforce just left. And so those were broadly what happened. And it was a mess, actually, to be really honest with you. There were a lot of clients who were very late in making those decisions, largely because HMRC's check employment status for tax tool only came out very, very late. So clients, public sector clients, didn't have a lot to work with in making their IR35 determinations. So they were left late. And so they kind of, in some ways, felt they had no other option but to minimize their risk by making those blanket determinations. Whereas I think this year, everyone should be in a much better position. There's still time now to get ready if you're not already in a position where you're feeling prepared. So there's still time to do that, taking reasonable care and avoiding that situation.
Thanks, Julia. And Julia, that problem you identified, whereby there was that talent flight from the public sector, if you like, into the private sector, and the private sector, I'm sure, could have absorbed those contractors coming into it, right? And the way I think about contractors now with this new legislation coming in, they're almost like hostages to fortune, right? And they're hostages to how an end user decides to categorize them using the appropriate means and methodology. And because of Brexit as well, this is something I think about. I think about these weird things a lot, but because of Brexit, where can these workers go, right? So they're really caught within the UK, right? Because it's the freedom of movement is probably going to be impacted to go and work in Germany or Netherlands or various other places. So there really are hostages in a way, which is a terrible way to describe it, but that's how I see it in my mind. And I know we're going to look at some of the problems that you really helpfully identified there, Julia. But before we look at the problems and the risks and the penalties, would either you or Declan have any non-binding advice for companies that are just starting the process? Because for people listening today, and I see some friends and partners and clients, not all organizations are fully prepared. We've worked, for example, with some organizations for nearly 3 years to get this process right. And they're very mature in their approach in relation to being operationally ready for IR35. And there's other, I suppose, clients and partners that we're hearing about anecdotally that just don't know where to start. And I suppose what I would like our message to be today, if it's palatable, is that there is time to start and there is time to get this right. But before we look at the sort of scary stuff, the fees, the risks, the problems, is there any practical advice that you, Julia, or Declan can offer to our audience today in terms of getting this process started?
I would say just get started immediately after this webinar. Just start looking at it. You can't put this off. The other side of it is it's not rocket science. These changes that are coming in, all it is changing who makes the IR35 determination from being the limited company contractor to the end client. So that's broadly the only change. So it's not rocket science, as I say, and the number of personal service companies operating in the UK, from memory, the last time I looked at that, is in the region of about 700 to 800,000 people. So it's again, it's a manageable. Now it does feel really, really significant for clients who are on this webinar right now or listening back at a later time. But honestly, there are loads of advisors out there that can help you get ready. Just get started.
I think that's a good shot. Declan, any thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, so I tend to adopt like a 5-step audit approach, if I can remember off the top of my head. But no, you start with what I mentioned earlier. You start by seeing if it actually applies to you, if it applies to your business, if it applies to your engagements. Are you too small to actually be caught by this, and so the status quo sort of maintained? And then if it does seem like you are caught, then you look to try and understand who in your off-payroll population is caught by this. And so obviously IR35 applies to contractors with the intermediary companies, the personal service companies. But no, there is news from HMRC that they're going to review all your off-payroll population to do an investigation. They are going to review sole traders as well, so you might want to include them in your list of just the off-payroll population list. And sometimes it's not as easy as you would think. Now, my main thing that I've been doing is helping clients with an audit. And you'd be surprised that clients often don't know who they have. Do you know? Especially if they've got disparate sites. The disparate sites all have their own hiring managers and their own process. Maybe they don't have technology. They actually create a consistent approach. You know, so it is an element of finding them. Maybe all the people on this call are great and you've got all vendor management systems coming out your ears and it's all great. And that's brilliant. But no, just make sure you get that list in place. And then once you've got that, and maybe you actually have to do this before, but no, you want to have a good IR35 internal team in place. You can't just give it to the junior HR person. That just doesn't work. And it won't be you taking reasonable care. Part of reasonable care is having an appropriately trained team internally to make your IR35 decisions. So you need to have that team in place. And there should be suitably senior people in there from legal and ops and commercial, because difficult conversations may be needed. You know, this may involve transformations of how services are engaged and purchased and procured. Or like you might need a new vendor management system put in place, and that's not easy, is it? And you can't have a junior HR person trying to chat to the CEO about that, tell them that they need to increase their budget for that particular thing massively. Because I've seen it, and I've had to tell clients that you don't have the right people speaking to me. I need to have different people speaking to me, and internally you need to do that. So you need to look at that and make sure you've got that team in place. And then the team needs tools to do that investigation. So by way of example, I'm probably very old school and I'm not maybe as technologically advanced as your company, Connor, but like I'm pretty much working off, and I'm dealing with probably 100 contractors or less. So I'm working off Excel spreadsheets with lots of questions along the top, testing the employment status factors, judged against the contractors down the side. I pull together questionnaires for contractors and their points of contact at the business, not their managers, their points of contact. I know you should go off and have chats with those people as well. And then also I have a template status determination statement, sort of written guidance company, all of that. So that creates like a nice audit trail, but you might have your own ability to do that internally with some kind of technology systems, or you might engage IR35 specialist providers to give you that kind of technology, especially if you've got lots and lots of people and you need one focal central point to do that. So then you have that audit trail, and then you go off with those tools. You go off with those tools, find the information, create that audit trail so you can use that to then make a provisional determination to really get a feel then for how your business is looking, whether it's inside, outside, or somewhere in between. How much of those do you have? And not just that, the audit should also show up if you have appropriate contractor onboarding and engagement systems in place and the right culture. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to get that information that you need. You're going to miss, I've seen all this, you're going to miss contractors. You're going to have fights with commercial managers who just say, I have no time for this, and not give you the information that you need. So all that may need to be looked at, and you can do it quickly. You'd be surprised how quickly you can do these things, and maybe you break it down into different units if you've got a massive company with some overarching kind of committee above them. But it is doable as long as you get on it quick. And then with that provisional information, you can decide what to do next. You need to fix your systems and culture, as well as we have lots of inside IR35. What do we do with them? Proceed on the inside IR35 basis. Do we gross up the amount because they're great contractors and we want to keep them, which is some of my clients have done. They've taken on more cost to keep these great contractors. Or you can go in the middle, each takes the cost, or you can actually say, you're getting a good deal here, we're reducing your fee anyway. And so you can proceed on that basis, or you might decide to outsource the services, big blocks of services, to some kind of emphasis type company or something like that if it's in the IT world. Or maybe bring in PAYE agency workers, or just bring them on, just sack away with all the contractors and all these other kind of recruitment type things, and just bring people on as your direct staff because you're used to that. All these options are there, but you have to think about them and consider them, and then give yourself a good bit of time to implement whatever you're going to do. So then come the 6th of April, you can satisfy your obligations, or at the very least realize, and we have to be truthful here, you may not be able to do a lot of that stuff by the 6th of April. So what some of my clients are doing, some of the bigger ones, and it seems to be in the engineering world because of all sorts of bureaucracy, but they're saying, look, they're inside now, but what we're going to do, we are going to do big systematic changes in the business, but they're going to take a long time. They'll probably take a year. So everyone's going to be inside now, but we're talking and we're engaging with the contractors, and we're telling them, look, this is all going to happen, and hopefully then we'll be moving outside. And that hopefully looks more genuine to HMRC than if you just made some little band-aid changes and then try to say everyone's outside, So even if you think there's no way we can do everything we need to do by the 6th of April, make sure you've got a contingency plan in place, and then you can sort out everything after. But yeah, so it just depends on your industry as well, because I know in engineering, it seems everyone's going to be inside from what I've seen, my own personal experience. So anyway, so I've rambled on there. Hopefully that was useful.
Do you know, Declan, that you made some really cogent points there. And, for anyone listening, I think you've given them a framework to work within. And Julia, I'd like to come back to you in a few moments, just in relation to some of the problems that you feel might arise for the fee payer, end users, and companies in the recruitment supply chain when it comes to actually implementing IR35, anything that you've come across. But there was two things, Declan, that you mentioned that relate, in my mind, to risk. So let's say an organization begins this exercise, and to one of the points that you made, they left someone out by mistake, right? They didn't do so recklessly, but they might have done so. They missed out 1 person, 5 people, 20 people in a site somewhere else. How punitive is the fine and risk regime from UK tax authorities, HMRC in the UK? My understanding, Declan, is that it starts off at 30%, depending on whether it's carelessness, which might be the case, if you leave a couple of people out, up to 100%. Would you mind just talking through the audience some of the risks and what those penalties and fines might look like if you get it wrong, either willfully or by mistake?
Yeah, so I can talk in general terms when it comes to the sort of sharp end of dealing with HMRC. I approach these things holistically, so I tend to have accountants and stuff that I bring in for this bit. There's my lawyery cop out for now. But yeah, you're right. As far as I'm aware, there was a schedule in the Finance Act 2007 which sets out think it's Schedule 24, which sets out what the penalties are. And it starts at 30 if you've been careless in reaching an inaccurate 30% of the lost revenue for HMRC, if you've been careless in reaching that determination. Then I think it goes to 70 if you've been deliberate in being inaccurate. And then 100% if you've been deliberate and you've concealed, such as by providing false information, etc. So yeah, so I think if you, especially if you knew you didn't have a good system in place, like think of clients I've dealt with, they have resources and to deal with it and put in place new systems. But if they don't, and they've been told that they should, then yeah, I would say that's probably careless. And HMRC being them, they may, this isn't really my area, but I imagine they may try and say that's deliberate because you knew you knew you had a bad system, you knew this could happen, so that's deliberate. And the situation would be, you just don't find these people, so you don't do the determination. You don't, if it is inside, you haven't paid the tax and NI and apprenticeship levy that should have been done. And so there might be interest, which I think is like 2.6% per annum, and the penalties, which we've just mentioned. So yeah, so it can increase that risk significantly, particularly if it's not just one. Maybe it's you've got a big organization and there's these one contractors, but there's lots of these one contractors floating about all over different business units. And some of my other clients have said that too, sometimes they just don't know because of the hiring system that you might have, this one-man band, which has been brought on as like a service provider as such, and they don't realize that it's a contractor, or the people hiring them don't realize it's a contractor, so they don't tell legal or finance in that way. So yeah, so there might be some of that, especially if HMRC come in and do like a proper full-on audit, which I think will probably happen with the big guys first. And a lot of this stuff is what I understand with the big guys is that you probably have a relationship manager with HMRC already. So I imagine you probably be in discussions with them anyway about how to avoid these situations arising anyway. So I imagine some people on this call will probably be way ahead on this stuff anyway and thinking about these risks. But yeah, that's my view on that.
Thanks, Declan. And Julia, just handing back to you. I guess, Julia, what problems do you think organizations, fee payers, recruiters will face? And is there a way to mitigate some of those problems in your view?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I did want to pick up on something that Declan said earlier, which was about getting the right people involved from the client perspective at the outset, because I've seen situations where you have a team who are making the IR35 determinations in the public sector, and they're then being overruled by other people within that organization. And it then starts to get really, really messy very quickly, because then you've got different views from kind of operationally versus kind of, the legal director or the tax director, and it just gets messy. So just be really clear about authority at the outset. So that's one point. In terms of kind of the supply chain, there's different ways you can manage that risk, and basically the fee payer is the organization that pays the individual. So if the end client is using a recruitment agency or a supply chain of some sort, then whoever is paying that individual, whether they're inside, assuming they're inside IR35, that is, they are then the fee payer, and they are liable for ensuring appropriate tax and national insurance. And the fee payer responsibility is, as far as I understand the legislation, is that HMRC just wants that individual, if they're inside IR35, to be paid via payroll. I don't think they care whose payroll it is, but it needs to be via a payroll so that they get all of their kind of information, and the RTI and the taxes are automatically done, etc. So if you're a client, you don't have to be that fee payer. You can work with other firms to take that responsibility away from you. And we'll probably talk about how the status determination has to roll through the supply chain. So you've got the end client who determines whether they're inside or outside IR35, and then then it rolls down through the supply chain to the fee payer. Now, providing the fee payer receives that status determination, then they have to ensure that tax is paid appropriately. So that is one area where things can go wrong, but it's also one area that is manageable. I mean, there's any number of kind of other aspects. You will want to make sure that any fee payers you're working with are actually going to be implementing the status that you've determined, because we have seen in the public sector scenarios where that didn't happen, even when there's a contractual agreement in place for that to happen, because the fee payer organisation has then done something sneaky on the side to pay the worker gross, which is clearly in breach of the legislation. So I think there's kind of an obligation on clients to make sure that their supply chain is working compliantly. Now, you can look at this to the nth degree. Sorry, I couldn't get my words out. Or you can, it depends what level you want to look at it, really. I personally, if I was a client, I would want it really robust. I would want it absolutely rigid, that there is no possibility of me determining someone inside IR35 to them being paid gross or whatever, or there being non-compliance throughout the supply chain. But I can rabbit on about this all afternoon, and possibly that's enough for now. I don't know, Connor.
Yeah, no, Julia, that's spot on. I just wanted to get both your views on some problems, but also how they're solvable. And I don't want to focus too much time, guys, on which categories of workers have been or will fall into the scope of IR35. So if we can just focus on this one really quickly. So we've had conflicting legal advice. Right? Some of our legal counsel has suggested that sole traders actually might be in scope for an SDS and going through the process. But from our discussions with yourself, Julia, and from Declan, and just for anyone listening, what is in your view, guys, and it's only your view, it's not binding legal advice, in your view, folks, are sole traders inside the scope of IR35, or should they be forgotten about and packaged up elsewhere?
I can kick off, seeing as I've not yet muted myself. In my view, sole traders are outside the scope. But that said, when engaging sole traders, there's still a responsibility to know whether they are genuinely self-employed. Otherwise, you could find yourself with a tax bill. So they are outside of the scope of this legislation, but I know a number of large firms are reassessing their sole traders in the round of doing this with their personal service company contractors, just for parity, for one sense, I guess, but also just to make sure for their own peace of mind that they're not engaging someone who isn't actually genuinely self-employed. But I mean, I'll happily let Declan tell us the legalities.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah, so to be honest, they're not caught by the legislation around IR35, but there is separate, and this is more tax, there is separate liabilities for you as the client if you're sole traders or deemed to be employees of yours using the same kind of test. There is no company then between you and them, and you will be the deemed employer and have all the payroll obligations. So as far as I'm aware, I'm just a lowly employment lawyer. I don't get access to HMRC, but from my accountancy contacts who I work with quite closely on this, they have had webinars like this with HMRC, and HMRC are saying that their teams will look at sole traders. They will look at all of your off-payroll population. It just makes sense. Economies of scale, doesn't it? They're not just going to come in and say, oh, we won't bother with that potential revenue. They're not going to do that. They're going to look at all of them. So in terms of, are they in scope? You don't have to do the bells and whistles states determination statement in the way you have to for IR35, but you do have to have some kind of audit there to show why you think that they are self-employed if you're treating them that way. And I think otherwise the same types of penalties might apply. As I say, it's not my area, but that same kind of risk may apply then anyway. So it is worth doing. And to be honest, when you're looking at all this, you're going to be looking at potential big changes about how you engage services. You might actually just be using outsourced service providers in the end, and that will affect sole traders. You kind of need to know who you've got to decide what you want to do. Hopefully that's not too.
No, it makes it both of you make a lot of sense. And I guess it really starts at what Julia's advice was. which is just bloody start the process, you know, start to look at these workers and categorize them. And I think it would be prudent to look at the sole traders doing this exercise as well. So guys, this one I'm really looking forward to all the discussion points, but particularly in relation to the CEST tool. Julia and Declan, we had a great discussion earlier in relation to why it's potentially problematic. So Julia, if you could just give some context into why it's problematic and why is it problematic, and Declan has some advice potentially for organizations on how to, I guess, augment the CEST tool. So Julia, over to you, please.
Yeah, so one of the main issues with the check employment status for tax tool is that it doesn't consider mutuality of obligations, or at least it doesn't consider it in the same way that most advisors in this sector do consider it, and most employment law specialists. So in short, in a nutshell, mutuality of obligation is an indicator of employment, and basically there is an obligation on the client to give work, and there's an obligation on the individual to do that work. So there's that mutual obligation in an employment relationship. But in a contracting relationship, there shouldn't be that mutuality of obligations. So you should be able to bring that individual in to do work as and when, and if you offer them further work, they're not obliged to accept it. And actually, they don't even have to necessarily do the work when you expect. Or, I mean, it just depends on kind of what your specific contract of engagements says. So that's mutuality of obligation. Now, HMRC have a view that by virtue of by virtue of there being a contract in place, that there is mutuality of obligation. Now, hopefully people listening to this webinar will think, hang on a minute, I've got a contract with these people to do work for me, but there is no mutuality of obligation. If that's what you're thinking, you're right. But HMRC's tool and doesn't really consider mutuality of obligation properly, and that's the major flaw in it. And you know, the other flaw in the tool is that they say that they will stand by the results generated by the tool, and they will, providing that it is that correct information is input into the tool. So there have been a couple of cases. The one that springs to my mind is NHS Digital, who ended up with a £4.3 million bill, even though they used the check employment status for tax tool, but HMRC's view was that they didn't use it correctly, and they still ended up with a bill, even though they did use it. So HMRC will stand by the tool, providing it's been used correctly. Well,
that's mind-boggling in my view. And you know, I haven't touched law for years, but Declan, so you know, for the end users on the call that are using the CEST tool, and they're concerned about what Julia has just said, and particularly in reference to the NHS case, is there any practical steps that they should follow to augment what the CEST tool does?
Yeah, so it's basically looking into mutuality of obligations with either your own internal experts or using external experts like lawyers, accountants, IR35 specialists. And also know there's a variety of IR35 tools out there. They're like CEST, like it's a piece of software. You go on, it asks you lots of questions, you input your answers, and it outputs you a status determination. So the ones that are provided by private companies, those will have mutuality of obligations questions where you think so anyway built into it to give you that wider, deeper analysis. Because the courts are showing that mutuality of obligations is more of a scale, whereas as Julia mentioned, HMRC are saying, well, no, it's just one thing. It exists, you know. So we don't need to test it because it exists. Where the courts are generally saying, no, there's a variation here among how much mutuality of obligations that there is. So yeah, definitely worth doing a bit of a deeper analysis into. But no, you can use assessed. You can use it as part of that, at least that provisional decision making. Now, it's not. At least they'll give you an idea of where HMRC might fall in this. Because to dispute with HMRC, you have to spend lots of money going to court, you know. So if you can get an outside result with CEST and you've genuinely used it accurately, and there are genuine substitutions and your contractors maybe have, especially maybe in the engineering world, and there's a few on there, if your subcontractors have to spend quite a lot on machinery that is particular to your engagement and you don't reimburse that, it's just built into the cost. That's all quite powerful stuff. And I think the algorithm, don't ask me to explain it, but the algorithm behind CEST, that weighs heavily on the substitution piece and on the financial cost piece. So it's not all bad potentially, if you look into it. But yeah, if you do have contractors who are operating on this per project basis, and it might be that if there's no services they offer, you don't offer them, and sometimes they might be doing something for someone else, and so they don't accept that project. Then you're not getting a fair crack of the whip there, because you're not really able to show like that. And that, I think it was the Department of Work and Pensions case where the consultant firm Relk Consulting, they had a bit like that. They worked for the Department of Work and Pensions for ages, but there were lots of gaps where they did other things or they weren't offered services, and the court found in their favor and said that was a sufficient lack of mutuality of obligations to point to self-employment. So yeah, rambled on again there, but in short, definitely use the tools that are available internally and externally to do a deeper analysis for sure.
Gotcha. Thanks, Declan and Julia. And guys, we've got some questions here. Richie Smith, who actually introduced us all today to get us together, has some cracking questions there. And we know Richie well. Richie, we will come back to you. I see a question, I think, from Dougal McIntosh, formerly of the Capita Resourcing Parish. And Dougal's question, Julia, is, have you guys any advice if the working and hiring manager game the questionnaire, or maybe the worker provides their services changes during the assignment? Have you got a view on that to help Dougal out with that question?
Wow, that's a great question, and it's really difficult. It's almost impossible to answer. But what I would do is be really, really clear with your kind of policies and procedures within your organization that actually it is not acceptable to game the questionnaire, and to take disciplinary action if necessary against anyone that you find that has done that. Because the point is, making these decisions can only be done on a factual basis, and it's based on the working practices. So you might have the best contract in the world, but if the working practices indicate someone being inside IR35 and therefore taxed as an employee, if that's how they work, that is going to be kind of the finding if it went to tribunal. So there's an education piece about everyone in your organization, as far as possible, understanding the importance of not only of these contractors working in particular ways, but ensuring that they are genuinely treated as contractors and not as potentially a member of staff. And there's a laughable case that I always quote in these things where doing some work with an organization and they've tried to integrate their contractors into their staff team, which is great, so everyone works well together, and they had team member of the month, and it got given to a contractor who wasn't even a member of staff. So I mean, it's just bananas, but you can understand how that silly little detail can happen so easily. So it is about communicating the importance of these changes within your organization, and the importance of behaviors and the impact that can have. I'm not altogether certain I've answered the question, because there isn't really an easy answer there.
Yeah, I think, Dougal, I think it's a great question. Julia, I think you've done a fantastic job actually of answering that question, because it's such a problematic area. So
if I could jump in, if you know of inconsistencies as the IR35 team, and you know that it's gains, then you have to call that out and deal with that. And if HMRC see that, they'll just see the answers, they'll just disregard the answers and then start being really skeptical of it. So yeah, so keep a lookout for that. Get some kind of maybe education piece, as Julia said, training, and maybe some kind of contractor do's and don'ts type internal policy for managers. So yeah, no, there is a big, as I say, education and learning piece around this, and ramming home that, look, we're not messing around with tax. Now, ultimately, if we actually try and game it, then you start getting into territory of potentially corporate tax evasion offences and stuff like that. Again, not my area, but no, you're getting towards that. If you're gaming stuff in relation to tax, you have to be so careful with it. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. I'm a big square. So no, I'll always follow that side of things. That now, if you know internally that people are not being consistent or with what you know, then you have to disregard or dig deeper and try and educate them.
Yeah, I agree, guys. And I think no sane company would embark on that path, right? Given the HMRC powers in the UK and also the fine regime. You know, if we look at the concealment piece risk that Declan mentioned earlier, we're looking at 100% of the loss or unpaid taxes to HMRC plus prosecutions on top of that. So we got a couple more questions, one from Richie relating to blanket policies. Richie, we're going to deal with that in relation to reasonable care. Linda, I see your question, Linda McGill, in relation to employee size. I think just going back to what Declan, employee numbers, I think it's more to do with your company's turnover in the UK and also your balance sheet as opposed to the number of employees that you have. But I might be wrong in that, Declan.
Well, it's the three. So there's the three things, three thresholds, and if you match two of them, then you're a small company. So if I can remember again correctly, so match two of these, so then you're fine. So not more than 10.2 million on the turnover. Sorry. Not more than 5.1 million on the balance sheet, which is all to do with assets and things over my head, and not more than 50 employees, and that's to do with an average calculation over the year. I would have to refresh myself on how to actually do that calculation. I've never actually had to do it. Clients have just tended to know pretty much whether they're in or out, and it tends to fall mainly maybe on the other two bits, the turnover. Although it can go either way, because because a lot of companies these days, the balance sheet is a big one. Well, they might actually hit the turnover and they might hit the employees, but no, lots of companies these days don't own any assets. They ever rented or whatever, you know. So, but worth looking into with your accountant, or feel free to get in touch after, because as I say, there are complicated rules around it about which financial year, because it might not be the financial year you think that you have to start with. It's all to do with when your financial year ends, and there's that 9-month period between ending and when you have to put in the filing period. And so that all is relevant to working out which one you use. So it might actually be the previous one, to what you think. And as I say, there's a rule around having to not hit those thresholds for 2 years to lose that small company status. So it's not as simple as I'm sort of saying in brief. So if you are around the thresholds, definitely worth taking some advice from. You can come to my firm, but accountants are probably best in that case, I would say, because they can tell you about balance sheet more than a lawyer ever would be able to.
Thanks, Declan. Thanks, Julia. So, Julia, just moving on to what is an SDS? Again, we love the acronyms in this recruitment, staffing, human capital world. What the hell is an SDS, and what should organizations do in terms of best practice to communicate the SDS?
Yeah, so SDS just stands for Status Determination Statement, which again sounds quite confusing when you say it out loud, actually. But basically, a client is, when they've decided whether someone is inside IR35 for tax purposes or not, they would then provide both the individual concerned and also the next level down the supply chain, whether that's a recruitment agency or an outsourced, oh gosh, I can't even think what the appropriate terminology is, but if you outsource your recruitment, then the status determination statement covers what the status is that you have determined, whether they're inside or outside IR35, and the reasons for that. And that then is communicated through the supply chain and to the individual concerned. And the individual concerned then could decide to disagree with that status determination statement and appeal it. But I think we might be going to cover that later. But Declan, tell me if there's any more particular detail than needed, because I realise I've just kind of skated over the top of that.
Yeah, to be honest, the actual legislation that deals with it's quite minimal anyway. So it's basically just a written statement that, as you just said, sets out whether these particular pieces of sections of the legislation apply, are they a deemed employee or office holder for tax purposes or not? And then you have to give the reasons for that answer. And so in my there is no prescribed form around that. It doesn't say that you have to do all this stuff and give it in this particular way. It just has to be some kind of statement that is able to pass down. So it makes sense to use. There will be lots of SDS templates knocking around, and not selling by one at all, but just giving it as an example. Yeah, so I've got this fairly, there's a bit of feedback there. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Sounds like a Hoover.
Line, please. Thank you, guys.
So yeah, so where was I? So on the status determination statement. So yeah, so the one that I use, it's fairly detailed. So it sets out, and it does refer to the particular legislation and the sections, because it does kind of say that in the legislation that you should say whether I think it's section 61NA applies or not, you know, so we kind of use that terminology. And then what we'll do then is have schedules, so you can append an explanation of the investigation that you've carried out, as well as a schedule which pretty much has the status determination factors down one side, each in-person service, mutuality of obligations, control, etc., with your kind of summary view of where you landed on that, with an overall kind of view at the end, because that's what you're kind of meant to do. You're meant to look at all the different bits and then come to an overall view at the end. And by doing that, that helps you take reasonable care, and that's in the legislation. You have to take reasonable care when coming to your determination, or else it's not a status determination statement, and in which case you would remain as the fee payer because you haven't passed that down the chain. So so doing all that, showing your audit trail, showing you've done a complete and thorough determination, having lots of information. I'm a lawyer. I like to see that lots of information in there in this kind of compliance world. So that's the route I would take. I think you mentioned, though, should they do less because then there's less likelihood of an appeal. I think there's probably more, in my opinion, knowing what employees, knowing what individuals are like, where they feel they've been left in the dark, where they feel that some kind of decision has been made without any kind of consideration. That's when they're more likely to kick up a fuss. But if you can, in my opinion anyway, if you can show, here's what we've done, we've done all this, and this is what we made our decision on. In my opinion, that makes that harder to appeal against. They may pick holes in it, but you've done that thorough position. And if they've raised nothing new, then you can pretty much just confirm the old status determination statement then. So some lawyers, mainly when they're dealing with litigation, will probably say less is more. And I'm the same, to be honest. Whenever I'm dealing with an actual dispute, like an employee dispute, less is more sometimes. But I think in this kind of world where you have this obligation for reasonable care, and it's in the legislation, and there's guidance on the HMRC Employment Status Manual online showing you what reasonable care is, then yes, just show exactly what you've done, because you've done it anyway. And HMRC might be looking at this, and contractors and fee payers if they appeal.
Yeah. And Julia, thanks for that, Declan. Julia, I was thinking about it from the individual contractor's point of view. When she or he or their PSC company gets this determination, right? They're obviously humans, right? And for me, this whole process should be as empathetic and sympathetic as possible, because the net of this is that PSC workers could potentially be losing money each month, right, compared to what they were previously used to. Would your view be, Julia, that we should in the SDS include as much relevant information as possible to make that decision or determination a bit more palatable for the worker?
Yeah, for sure. I get the legal argument for perhaps being a bit more choosy with what you include, but I think the fuller the explanation, then the easier it is for someone to understand. And also then it could be that in making that determination, you have genuinely missed something along the line. And so therefore, if that is the case, then someone will be able to kind of raise that with you through the appeals process. But yeah, I think the more detail, the better, because especially if it's an unpalatable message that someone's receiving, then they need to know the reasons why. And I wouldn't just, communicate it just in writing. If you can have face-to-face meetings, or as much as you can, of course, at the moment, and to have a discussion point, then that can help. I realize if you've got lots and lots of contractors that you're looking at, then those individual one-to-one meetings might not be possible, but it might be possible to bring together groups of people or kind of cascade that through the organization, so and empower other people to have those meetings. So I agree with you that the more you can do to be supportive towards the individual, the better.
So like some of of my clients are doing exactly that. Now they want me to help train up their managers who deal with the contractors to have those conversations. So it's not someone from London in legal, dealing with someone up in engineering person in Scotland. They're dealing with their manager who they kind of trust or whatever, and getting that message to them. So yeah, definitely I agree with that, Julia.
Good. Guys, I appreciate we've hit the top of the hour. If you're willing to go another 10 minutes, I know some people are pinging me here privately saying we really want to hit a number of these topics. If you guys can spare another 10 minutes, we'd really appreciate that. And for anyone that wishes to hang on, we'll keep the webinar open for another 10 minutes, because I see a cracking question here from John Henderson of, I probably can't mention names or whatever on the call, but John, it's a smashing question that we'll get to very shortly. So I think we've dealt pretty well with the reasonable care approach. Richie Smith asked a question on, are you, Declan, or Julia, seeing many organizations adopt a blanket decision? I think there's a wider question here, which is, if you're an organization, you're sitting here today and you're going, oh my word, we need to act now. We don't have time to do all the things that the panelists and CXC and other independent advisors are recommending we do. We're just going to do a blanket approach. What do you say to that, Julia and Declan? Would you recommend that? Would you say, please don't do that, and here's why? What's your thoughts, guys?
I definitely wouldn't recommend a blanket approach. If you can do something that shows a higher level of reasonable care, I think you will be in a much better position to deal with any questions that come up. I completely understand that time is against you, so you might be considering doing a blanket approach, but if there's any way that you can find yourselves to not do that would be my view. But I think, Declan, when you were speaking earlier, you had kind of a suggested middle ground on that.
No, I was just saying, if the client was also the fee payer and everyone was going to be inside, then no. So the issue is, if you don't take reasonable care, then you'll remain as the fee payer. But if you're the fee payer anyway and everyone's inside, then in reality there might be little risk on you, because you're going to be paying all the tax anyway. And what would be the risk there? HMRC is not really going to come in and hit you over the head with that if they're getting what they want. They're getting their revenue. And then if the contractors appeal, then if you just stick with your original decision, what route do they have then? No, it's not really my area, but I think they would have to go to HMRC probably first, and probably not get very far with them. And then you're talking then about these individual contractors themselves, or maybe banding together individually to bring some kind of tax tribunal or court case, which would be very expensive. So, and that for a lot of companies is probably going to be a very low risk. So if that is the case, then you're both client and fee payer right anyway, then you might not be too concerned, and you might just press ahead with blanket approaches. But if you do use outsourced providers, and maybe there is a mix in there of outside and inside, etc., then you might want to be a bit more careful, because if you're done blankets for some, and then HMRC might come in and look at your other outside, just to see if you've done that properly or not. And you will remain as the fee payer, and you'll have all the tax to deal with, etc. Where you think that's gone over to the fee payer, it's not, it stayed with you. So it really just does depend, I think, from business to business. And I think a lot of the companies I've seen on this list will probably use outsourced providers to be the fee payer. So in reality, you probably don't want to do blanket approaches, or else there's no point of you using that fee payer, just practically. So and yeah, so you won't be taking reasonable care. The only in the guidance, in the employment status guidance, there is a little section which says you can make blanket determinations and still reasonable care if all of the contractors have the exact same working conditions and the exact same terms and conditions. But I mean, is that really going to be realistic? Probably not. Everyone probably have slightly different arrangements, etc. So in reality, if you want to take reasonable care, if you're using fee payers and you want to make sure they remain the fee payer, probably best to avoid blanket approaches. So I've been dealing with companies who definitely have not taken blanket approaches. They've definitely done a sort of by contractor approach. It might be that in the provisional stage, they might realize that some are kind of similar and kind of group them in to the provisional decision, just so they can understand what to do afterwards, and they don't just save on time. But no, come the final, because it might be that those contractors aren't actually contractors anymore for IR35 purposes, depending on what they want to change. So you might want to do all the work at the provisional stage, but definitely come April when you have to satisfy those obligations, yeah, probably best to avoid the blanket determinations.
Yeah, I think that's prudent. Julia, just putting on our advocacy hats for the independent contractor and the worker, or whatever they're so designated. They're in an organization today, let's say a large global bank or UK bank, and they've made this blanket decision that now their PSCs are going to be essentially PAYE workers. In your view, what potentially is the remedy, if any, to say, well, actually, no, we're a bloody PSC here, and here's why. What can they do, if anything, about this?
Well, I would never underestimate the power of social media. So there are very increasingly well-known groups of contractors who are naming and shaming what they perceive to be poor treatment by their clients in terms of IR35 and the off-payroll regulations. So that's one thing. So you could find as a client that your reputation is damaged if you don't do this stuff as carefully as you might, particularly if you're making blanket determinations. And the contractor workforce is very, very alive to blanketing, because it did happen in the public sector. So be wary of that. From a practical perspective, if a personal service company worker is told that their assignment is inside IR35, on a practical basis, they don't have to accept that. They could choose to work elsewhere. On an even more practical basis, if they are taxed as an employee, then the only real cause for redress, if they really feel that they have been unfairly taxed, is to attempt to reclaim that from HMRC. Now, I've not heard of any such claims being successful, but it is a form or a process called P800 would be the process to say to HMRC, I've paid employment taxes and I shouldn't have. Now, I personally think it's highly unlikely that would be a viable way forward, but that is what HMRC have previously told me is the option open to them.
Interesting. So I think that's potentially problematic for any organization that doesn't take our advice and opinion in relation to blanket decisions. That could be distinctly unpalatable for them. So guys, in the interest of time, Julia, you're probably got the most expertise of anyone I know in relation to umbrella companies. Is there any risks in your view for end user organizations using an umbrella company as a fee payer? And what sort of umbrella company, if any, should they use in that event?
Okay, well, the simple answer is it depends. Crikey, I should be a lawyer, shouldn't I? Yeah, it does just depend. But basically, if you are so an umbrella company, a good umbrella company offers a solution to the IR35 problem, because a good umbrella company will employ the worker on a contract of employment, so they are fully employed, and therefore IR35 status becomes irrelevant because they're an employee. So that's point number one. Point number two is that not all umbrella companies are everything they portray themselves to be. So not all of them will necessarily employ the worker. Not all of them will necessarily be processing tax properly. Some of them will perhaps present you with pay slips, etc., that appear that they are processing tax properly, but they might not be doing that in reality. So the risks of using a poor umbrella company is that, well, for a start, I wouldn't even call these poor ones umbrellas, because for me, an umbrella is firmly a business that employs the worker. But that aside, there are some schemes out there that purport themselves to be an umbrella, whereas actually they're anything but, and they can be tax avoidance schemes. So what I always say to contractors is, when choosing an umbrella, make sure they put all of your income through PAYE, and make sure you check your tax record with HMRC to ensure that has actually happened. That is the foolproof way of doing it. Now, from a client perspective, you so you obviously don't have access to all of the workers' HMRC records. That would be ridiculous. So from a client perspective, you want to do as much due diligence as you can about the umbrellas that you might be working with, to ensure that they are reputable and that they are everything that they seem.
Gotcha. Thanks, Julia. That's spot on. So, guys, I'm really looking forward to discussing this question that John Henderson has raised. It relates to Dougal's question of gaming the system, but specifically what John is asking is, gaming the system should also probably give a nod to some contractors attempting to rebadge their, in brackets, labour-based services to avoid the regulations, I assume IR35, by saying they're statement of work or contracted out services. HMRC guidance recognises this practice too. So, guys, in your opinion, is that a way to successfully avoid the IR35 regulations? Or if an organization is going to go down this route, are they storing up some trouble for themselves in future?
So I'll jump in. So I think they're storing up trouble for themselves in future. So a statement of work, I think it's actually, as far as I'm aware, like an American term. It's not really a term that's used in the UK. And the UK one is more contracted out service. And then what that means is that you're outsourcing basically a big block of your services, like you probably already do, as part of your procurement processes, to catering companies, IT companies, maintenance companies, so big companies with their own staff. And that's what it's meant to look like. It's not meant to be, a contractor one day providing their labor and the next day being this big outsourced service provider, being one person. I don't think that's going to get very far. And if it's the recruitment company behind them saying, all right, we're a recruitment company today, and then the next day, oh yeah, no, we're now an IT company actually, or no, we're now a maintenance company. Again, it's not really going to hold much water, because you have to look to see if these businesses have actually transformed their business. Now, do they have the expertise on the board to fulfill like a massive IT project? Now, do they have the assets or the insurance to be able to cover the liabilities that have come with performing the actual service and delivering the service, as opposed to just giving the labor? Now, is it in a regulated environment? Are they providing those services now into an FCA regulated company? And before, they had these contractors doing these regulated roles. Is that company now regulated by the FCA to be able to do that? Has the FCA company actually fulfilled their own FCA obligations on outsourcing? Because it has specific, you have to make sure that people you outsource to are in proper control of their affairs. And that may apply in the aerospace industries and the pharma industries, all those regulated industries. Basically, if you want to do, in my opinion, and this is backed up by the guidance on the employment status manual, if you want to be doing this statement of work, if you want to call it that, you basically just have to think in the same terms that you're already outsourcing services in relation to. You have to use those same kind of service level agreements, and then the statement of work is just the sort of schedule for the assignment that attaches to that. But you have to probably go, because there's a lot of big companies I see on here. I'm pretty sure you have fairly stringent procurement processes. You're going to have to go through all that if you genuinely want to say it's the outsourcing again. Or else HMRC will say, well, it's not really, because you didn't even do your own usual outsourcing processes. So think in terms of that. Are you outsourcing to a business that can actually provide the IT service, can provide the maintenance service? Do they actually have now the ability to perform that service? So for example, if it is a maintenance company and say engineering, they may have to then supply the materials. Are they able to get the materials? Do they understand, like with Brexit, how to get that supply chain in? You have to think like that. Or else you could have that fiasco like that company that was taking over the ferries for the government, but had like T's and C's from a chip shop on their website. That's how far you might get into that farcical kind of arena. So yeah, so if it's going to be a statement of work, make sure you're using companies that actually do that service and are not just providing the labor, for sure. Anyway, that's my obviously very strong view, and that's very strong for a lawyer, of course. But yeah, just look in the government, look at the HMRC guidance, and you'll see that an actual proper statement of work contracted service will be few and far between unless they are sort of established businesses in that area.
Sure. Thanks, Declan. Julia, do you agree or disagree or no view on the matter?
Well, there is an argument for saying that that if it was a business-to-business service, it should have already been some sort of statement of work anyway, and you pay on key deliverables, etc. But in terms of I would be quite concerned as a client right now to be going to be significantly changing how those individuals are engaged, because any such wholesale changes right now would potentially be a red flag. So yeah, I would proceed carefully. There is a lot of talk that it is the magic bullet. It isn't, for the reasons that Declan outlined. However, there are scenarios where it could be a suitable way forward. So yeah, as I say, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm sitting on the fence, aren't I?
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't mean IR35 doesn't apply. If the contractors are still used, then it just means that the service provider becomes the client and not you, who's listening. The end user hire becomes the client. But I mean, it shouldn't be the same. You talked about individuals there being used in a different way. It shouldn't be the individuals. You're not hiring individuals anymore. You're hiring a company to provide a service. And so if it just looked like everyone was just coming, on Friday we're all contractors, and then on Monday everyone's just coming back in and doing the same thing, and it's contracted out service. Now it's probably going to look a bit odd if there's been no transformation for that business who's taken on that service to think about how it's going to profit more from that, and to think about changes it can make to deliver that service in a more efficient and profitable way. So it has to be an actual proper business change. If you're using a recruiter or whoever is now saying we're transforming into this other business, there's a lot of sophistication behind that you'll have to do your due diligence on. And the kind of companies I'm seeing on this list, I imagine will have very tight procurement policies and processes.
Yeah, agreed. And Dave Newton makes a good point here. Someone we know very well and whose company has a fantastic approach to mitigating and ensuring they're ready for IR35. But we're suddenly on April 6th, a lot of PSC workers now say, well, we're statement of work providers. So I think the advice is, I'm loath to use the word advice. The steps that you give, Declan, would be good steps to follow. And you could really take that back to the nth degree, look at the company's article associations, what their designation is on the company's registration office. If their designation is something so far removed from statement of work services specific to a specific thing, then, you could really just go, you're actually a PSC, mate, and here's our determination status.
Yeah, and if there's any companies listening in who are recruitment companies and thinking of doing that, and now this is an extra little point to add on. If you have investors and who invested into your business, you might have to go through a whole process with them, because you might have investment agreements and, as you said, articles of association, which set out like reserve matters. And one of those will be, don't transform the business into something that it's not without approval. So it's all those kind of things. It's not simple. You're basically changing the entire nature of your business if you're transforming from recruitment to providing the service. So you're starting again, basically. You have to get new insurance in place. And as part of that, you're going to have to show that you have the internal expertise to actually plan and deliver and implement a service like that. Yeah. So yeah.
I think, listen, if I was to put myself in the shoes of a recruitment company wanting to transform to potentially get around these rules, I can see the rationale and logic for that. But I think anyone listening would be well advised to stay away from that path. Guys, I'm really appreciative of your additional time and, of course, our attendees today. There was a really great point. If you would do me the courtesy of just hanging on a few more minutes, if you may, if you have time. And Julia, I'd love to address this one to you. It's a bit of a sticky wicket, right? But it comes again from Dougal. Dougal, you get a gold star today for your questions. They're really good, really tough. Thanks so much for them, and indeed everyone else that has asked questions. But specifically, Julia, do you have a view on passing on the employer's national insurance cost to the worker? From Dougal's question, and Declan's shaking his head, me too, Declan. Lots of public sector organizations did this, even though it's not really on. Julia, over to you. What's your thoughts on the matter?
Yes, so we have seen that happen, and my view is that it shouldn't happen. Employers' national insurance should be paid by the employer. Now, what did happen in the public sector was that the contractual rates were unable to be increased to take account of the extra costs of employing, of someone being inside IR35 and having those employment taxes, one of which is employers' national insurance. So what did happen was that sometimes these rates were renegotiated through a process whereby then the individual is then told that actually this was your rate before, but this is your rate now. And if that individual then kind of was given all that information and decided to accept that contract, this is what we know has happened. I was looking very recently at a tribunal whereby they didn't allow that individual to reclaim an unlawful deduction for employers' national insurance because the firm that engaged them could prove that that individual was told about it and knew about it and signed and agreed to those terms. Now, however, in the situation where that individual genuinely hasn't known about it, there have been successful cases where the individual has been awarded an unlawful deduction case and they've then had that employer's national insurance repaid to them. So yes, it's wrong, so be very, very careful about doing that, because the off-payroll legislation is really clear that employers pay the employer's national insurance, not the individual themselves.
Right.
Declan? So you don't pass, in terms of what being a lawyer, what does pass mean, but yeah, you can't directly get them to pay that, and it's even normal employees, and you can't usually transfer that liability. So, but yeah, it is, as far as I'm aware, lawful to reduce the fee, and that's what, as I mentioned, some of my clients were thinking of doing. Probably just one of them actually out of, I don't know, maybe the 10, 15 that I've sort of helped with audits. Other ones are actually thinking of grossing up the fee, etc. But yeah, but it is appropriate, as far as I'm aware, whether it's wrong or right or whatever, and that's just a commercial negotiation, to reduce the fee, and then that's how that extra cost is dealt with. But on that point, Julia, it's a good point about disputes. Obviously, that's an emotive point. That's the one thing that's going to lead to a breach of contract claim. So you get that into a new contract, the rate has then been reduced. And I've that one client I mentioned, I've rejigged their contracts to allow a reduction if they were deemed employees. So yeah, so that's my view.
Interesting, guys. Some great advice. And guys, just one final point, Declan, I'll probably just gear this towards you. It comes from my good friend and colleague, John Smith, who's our managing director for the Americas in CXC. But essentially what John's saying here is that a lot of companies are still being audited when they brought in a similar classification test for independent contractors in the USA in the early 2000s. Declan, do you know off the top of your head, is there a limit or statute of limitations in terms of once this legislation's in the private sector, how far can HMRC go back? Is there, after 5 years, do they have a case to make, or is it unlimited in terms of investigating the end user?
Yeah, so it's not entirely that's not my area, but as far as I'm aware, HMRC can go back as far as they want. What they have said, though, in relation to this is that they will not use the determinations from the 6th of April to then launch. If it's inside, they're not going to then launch into the previous years. Okay. For that, if the contractors were with that person for a while, they're not going to launch into investigations for the previous years using the information given as part of that determination. But I have a lot of accountants and contacts who don't believe them. Because as far as I'm aware, I'd have to look at it, and there's so much legislation around this stuff. I don't think it's built into legislation that there's a prohibition on them doing that. And yes. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of nervousness around that for sure. But I would say on that one, speak to the people at the coalface with HMRC or accountants, and they probably have a better view because they'll know how HMRC operates in reality. So that's the recommendation I would make on that.
Okay, thanks, Declan. And Julia, you've got a final point to make in closing that I believe relates to supply chain compliance.
Yeah, I just realised, when you answer questions and you think afterwards, I should have said this and that, and so it was what I wanted to say about supply chain compliance is really about knowing the suppliers you're working with. So if you, I guess most of the people on the call today either work with recruitment process outsourcers or recruitment agencies or some similar organisations, make sure you work with them in relation to whatever umbrella or payroll arrangement or fee payer arrangement you might be putting in place, because those guys have been in the sector, assuming they've got suitable experience, which I'm sure they will have, judging by the companies on this call. They know the sector, so they will hopefully have preferred suppliers that they already work with and kind of trust. And the other thing I would be wary of is a piece of legislation called the Criminal Finances Act, which basically makes all businesses at risk of failing to prevent tax evasion, which is a criminal offence. So if you are potentially concerned that you may have some dodgy players within your supply chain who might be facilitating tax evasion, such as one of the dodgy schemes that are not even umbrella, make sure you take steps to protect yourselves, do your due diligence, and make sure you know who you're working with. Sorry, that was rather long, but I thought it was important.
And just to add on that, though, I would get evidence of their insurance to cover losses that may flow. I would build into the contracts various warranties and indemnities, and also an contractual ability for you to audit their information, their systems, to make sure that you're getting that payroll information to confirm that the payments are being made if they need to. So all that kind of stuff should go into that due diligence. If you are, I've said this a few times, but if you're using smaller companies, obviously if you use the big reputable ones and the risk should be fairly low. But if you're using smaller ones, they may want the business, and you may want to see if you can get personal guarantees if possible, because you do hear of these recruitment companies doing Phoenix from the flames, or they'll go down 1 minute and pop up somewhere else. But if you can get personal guarantees with the directors potentially, then that gives you that extra protection, although probably being a bit optimistic with that one. So mainly just do a whole, as Julia said, if you are doing that due diligence, it should be a fairly robust process on the due diligence for sure.
Thanks so much, Declan, and thanks so much, Julia. Guys, your insights, experience, and expertise and advice was really helpful. We're getting a lot of positive feedback I can see in the chat here. Thanks also to everyone that's joined the webinar today. We'll be sending out a summary of what we've discussed today, and just wanted to thank our guests for staying on, and also our guest speakers for staying on. That was really, really interesting, guys, and some fantastic tips. So thanks ever so much, and have a great afternoon ahead, everyone. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Declan. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.